America because it's interesting to us and we enjoy it for its sake. But remember that we are in a community of scholars and scientists and area specialists. And it's important for us to establish to them why we should be studying Latin America and what we can learn from Latin America in the process. So let's be good political scientists and let's make an argument for why we should be studying Latin American politics. As I told you, first and foremost, population is maybe the biggest reason of all. The truth is that we have an enormous and growing Latino community in the United States. The majority of students at UC Merced, if I'm not mistaken, are Latino. These folks are a huge part of American society, and 60 million of them in growing make them the fastest growing part of the entire US population. This is a huge segment of our society. And because this segment continues to grow, it means that Latin American politics and the characteristics of the societies that Latinos come from remain very, very important. So for example, between 2000 and 2010, Latinos were the fastest growing community by a factor of 4, just absolutely astounding growth. Mainly individuals from Mexico, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and other parts of Latin America and Spain, but really all parts of Latin America. And those individuals are throughout our communities, throughout the entire country, in California, in New York, in Nebraska, where I'm originally from. They are an important and essential and large and growing part of our communities. Migration to the United States is often driven by economic and political motivations that relate to the quality of life or the safety of those societies or the economic prosperity of those societies. Individuals from Mexico and Honduras and Guatemala and Nicaragua, for example, may be fleeing economic or security circumstances that are perilous and that are a challenge, if not maybe a threat to their life. But they also come for other reasons as well. Opportunity, a variety of motivations send them. And in general, what we can say is that more migrants and refugees come from Latin America to the United States than anywhere else in the world. And so if there's a single place that we should be studying from the perspective of the size of the population, the growth of the population, there is no other place but for Latin America. And so Latin America is important in that regard, first and foremost. And what I'll add is that it isn't just the case that these communities are growing and constitute a huge portion of our communities and our population at large. It's also the case that migrants and immigrants are largely sending remittances back home. They're sending money back to their families that did not leave Latin America. And 75%, in fact, a large majority send money back to their families. And this is often the difference between survival and not for those who find themselves in the most challenging circumstances. This is essential. And it also means that there are a variety of transnational partnerships and networks, if you will, that emerge around groups in the United States that are expats, and then groups back home or families back home, organizations back home that are connected to the relatives of those families. So remittances aren't just a huge business and a huge source of revenue for individuals and families in Latin America. It's also the case that it has created a huge network, a huge set of systems and organizations that involve themselves in all kinds of transnational partnerships and cooperation and coordination. These are political innovations that follow from the economic reality of remittances, which are entirely a function of migration and the changes in population that we have already identified as being so important. So remittances are actually the largest source of income for many Latin American countries after tourism and trade. So just to give you a sense of how vital this is, that should put things in perspective. El Salvador, for example, could not survive without remittances. It's just one example. This is an old piece of data, unfortunately, but what I can tell you is that though in 2019, about 16% of the GDP came from remittances, it's about 21% at this point. So it's continued to grow. And by leaps and bounds, with each decade, a larger share of the GDP in El Salvador comes from money sent largely from the United States. So this is tied up directly with population, and it gives us a sense of how our large shared populations interact in ways that become politically and economically consequential. I'm going to take a look at the chat really quickly and see what's coming up here. Did you learn the language to communicate in Latin America? I speak a primitive form of Spanish that I do use in my conversations, but I admit that it's not something I use a lot, and I did pick it up while I was down there relatively quickly, even though I tried to pick it up before I went. I discovered that it was much easier once I was there, but I did speak Spanish, and it was harder to speak in Chile than in Argentina because in Chile it's spoken much faster and it's a little choppier, but absolutely, and that was a part of the experience. Um, I'm seeing a lot of interaction between students. I encourage you to form study groups if you find that useful for the readings. Of course, with exams and papers, I might encourage you to be careful about what might constitute unauthorized cooperation. But you certainly are encouraged to work together and to engage the material in all the ways that would be meaningful. So I always will support you with those kinds of things. If you want to check up with me about stuff, that's cool too. So remittances are very important. And let's show you a graphic that helps to put this in perspective. This is remittances sent from the United States to other countries. Migrants working in the US sent a staggering 138 billion back to their families. And what you can see is that the larger proportion of that, sort of roughly speaking, goes to Latin American countries, including Mexico and El Salvador, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, and Honduras, all the way down to Jamaica and Nicaragua. You name it, every Latin American country that's of a substantial size is on this map. And what you see is that the connections between our populations could not be more significant in this data, more significant than the links between expats, say, in China or India or the Philippines. Those countries are much, much larger than Latin American countries, and yet Latin American countries still by far appear to be the most significant source of revenue sent back to communities and individuals and families in Latin America. So this gives you a sense in kind of an empirical, graphical way how important those population and remittance dynamics really, really are. And because those populations continue to grow in the United States, the remittances are increasingly important. They've never been more important than they are today, and they'll be more important still next year and the year after that. And so this is a reason to continue to study Latin America. Now, we have other reasons too, and I don't want to be short with our discussion on these other issues that relate just as much to politics and social science. There's also the fact that we are becoming a Spanish-speaking nation ourselves. The truth is that a large plurality of Californians speak Spanish. 47% of people in New Mexico speak Spanish. These are huge, huge numbers. This is on the order of nearly a second official language, although the United States doesn't have any official language. I've often said or suggested that maybe we should have a couple official languages, or maybe we should consider English and Spanish because there are so many Spanish speakers. But this language link is important because it means that we can conduct more commerce together. We can engage in a lot of cooperation and coordination that we couldn't do otherwise. And that means then that we're more connected and politics remains relevant to what's happening on either side of the border. And so language is clearly important. We should emphasize the fact that there are so many Spanish speakers in the United States, being both immigrants, first, second generation, but also people who aren't Latino, but who speak Spanish because they interact with these populations themselves. So clearly language is important. There's also the fact that the United States does a lot of business with Latin America. So if you're in business, the Latin American market is a huge market. Brazil is one of the biggest economies in the world. Other economies like Argentina and Chile are also important markets because these are upper middle income countries that represent the potential to buy a lot of American goods. And those countries want to buy American goods. So if we're making the case to people in the United States why we should study Latin America, we should emphasize that there are very robust trading relationships between these countries. And so, for example, almost 13% of the United States exports go to Mexico. And though NAFTA has been revised and sort of dismantled, those trading relationships still exist. It's just that they've taken a different shape under a sort of different kind of policy. The fact is that countries like Colombia and Chile, in addition to Brazil and Mexico, are among our top trading partners. And so our exports wind up there. increasingly, and they will continue to do so. And so from the point of view of business and commerce and economic activity, there's a lot of joint activity and coordination between these places. And there's a good reason then to understand the politics and the political changes that might take place in Latin America. There are bilateral trade deals as well with countries like Chile and Peru and other Central American countries. These are also important. I'm sure that many of you have seen, for example, Chilean salmon or Chilean fruit or whatever it is you might find at the grocery store that comes from places in Latin America that maybe that you didn't anticipate. I'm going to take a look at the chat really quickly here. Did Ecuador start using the dollar as their national currency due to the amount of remittances that were coming into the country? No, Ishan. So Ecuador began using the dollar when they started using it because they had, they had a lot of issues with their currency. They had repeated currency crises, and they had a lot of inflation and some economic issues. And the idea was that they would adopt the dollar to try to stabilize some of the balance of payments issues and some of the currency crises that were occurring. So the dollar would sort of be a solution to the problem. That was the idea. And this is what other countries have done as well. Wait, is the presentation or on the recording? Yes, I'm recording this and the link will be on Cat Courses. It'll be viewable and downloadable on YouTube. So yes, I'm posting them beginning with this one. As Catholicism grew, the use of the Spanish language became the primary form of communication, right? That's correct. Remember that Latin America began with pre-Columbian ancient civilizations that spoke indigenous languages. And many of those languages are still spoken in Latin America, but Spanish is a legacy of Spanish colonial rule. So it's sort of uncomfortable, but it is a reality. We're left with that reality today as we wrestle with those legacies of colonialism. Why did El Salvador start using the dollar? Similar issue. They had a currency that was just very, very rife with problems and prone to crises. And they wanted to try to control the growth of the money supply and limit inflation and other economic consequences that were badly affecting the performance of the currency. So this is why these countries often will take on the dollar. Argentina did the same thing. I'm forgetting what year they had the dollar, but they did the same thing. Do you believe there was a silent Venezuelan rebellion earlier this year? We'll address that here momentarily, actually, in a roundabout way. Good question. Okay, so this is the final reason that we're going to discuss as to why we should be studying Latin America and what we should care about and how we can make our case to those who would question us and require us to justify our decision. Perhaps most importantly, Latin American political systems are very similar to our own. They are presidential systems above all, and they were largely modeled after the system here in the United States. They have more in common with our system than any set of systems or any system elsewhere in the world. Latin American democracies are very similar in terms of the executive branch, the congressional and the judicial branch, and the distribution of powers and the creation of check and balance institutions. So what this means then is Latin America is much more similar to us here in the United States than European countries and vice versa. We have much more in common with Latin American countries. And so what that means in the grand scheme of things is that we have a lot to learn from what happens in Latin American democracies. The crises that repeatedly seem to occur in many systems, the interbranch gridlock that sometimes occurs, the occasional difficulty presidents have generating legislative support, the potential for abuse of power by the executive with the great powers that they often wield. All of these issues unite Latin American countries in the United States. It brings us together and means that we have a lot to learn. And so what that means also is we can maybe be alarmed from time to time when we take a look at what's happening in some Latin American countries and we remember that our systems are very similar and the way they malfunction may be the same way that we malfunction. So this is an interesting and important set of issues that come up when we start to talk about democratic backsliding or abuses of power or the various political challenges that both Latin American democracies and the United States are facing at present. So The political component is obviously the most important because of the institutional similarities, but the economics, the language, the population mean that we have linked fates. Latin American countries and the United States have virtually everything in common. We're talking about the politics of diversity within presidential systems with check and balance institutions between countries that have economic ties, population ties, and ties of language and culture. It couldn't be more important to study Latin America than it is today. And so this is why we're studying Latin America and what we really hope to gain from studying Latin America. It was asked last class, what could we possibly gain, or what power can we gain from studying Latin American countries? And the answer is that we can gain the power to analyze the politics of diversity and to understand these particular kinds of issues that might arise in ethnically and racially diverse societies that have these particular types of political institutions and that have particular kinds of economic and trading relationships with other similar states. So this is what we can gain, and I hope that you'll stick with me as we go along and be open to the possibility of learning about how to analyze this diversity, because it really is probably the most remarkable feature of all of the region, and maybe the most interesting and useful thing about the region when it comes to politics and what we can learn about the world. So as we come to an end to this segment, we're facing two questions that really kind of come out of this discussion. First, if Latin America is so diverse ethnically and racially, and if the systems themselves tend to have so many similarities but some important differences, how should we begin to study politics in this region? How can we understand systematically what's happening in these places? And then on a similar note, how have scholars before us studied the region? How have they examined politics in Latin America in a systematic way that seeks to create insights that are general and can be applied to other systems and that can be used as knowledge, as theoretical knowledge in political science? So our focus today then is methods, and we're picking up, well, we're starting with that same question that I ended that last segment with, which is, how should we study Latin America? How should we study Latin America? This is a question that may seem striking and unusual to you. It may occur to you that simply focusing on these countries is the way to study them and to treat them as whole entities and to examine them in their sophistication and their diversity. Well, that's absolutely the case. We totally want to acknowledge and value that diversity. But even if we decide that we want to treat these cases with such respect and dignity, we still need a way to approach them methodologically, some sort of objective and kind of uniform way so that we can try to gain analytical leverage and produce insights that can travel throughout the region and even beyond the region. The question then is an important one because it's a complicated place. It's a diverse place. The number of country issues is staggering. And as I pointed out, we do need to limit ourselves to a number of issues and countries that we can deal with. And that means we have to make difficult choices about how and what to study. Even when we do that, however, we do still need to identify that approach methodologically that we will take to the countries and to the issues in the region. The question then is the same question that we started with, which is how can we begin to study such a diverse place? And I want to go back to this question. And I want to pause for a moment and step back. And I want to ask you. I want to ask you what you think. And I want to encourage you to use the chat and to reflect and engage and think about how we should be studying this region and how we should be dignifying this diversity and taking account of this complexity. So let's just pause. We'll take a second, take a few minutes maybe. And like before, I ask that you maybe engage with us and share your insight. And I would be happy and excited to read that input and kind of incorporate it as we go along. Hi, Armando. Yes, you can consider the first reading, absolutely. And if you have some insight of your own, I would encourage you to share that as well. But you can certainly consider the first reading and and kind of reflect and think about maybe what you took away from the reading. Carmina says that we can study Latin America by analyzing the differences between colonial and native indigenous institutions or ideals. Absolutely. That's a great idea. That's one of the first differences that comes up when we think about the periods that we're studying, right? The sort of collision, if you will, of the indigenous and the colonial institutions and ideals. Those certainly were very different. And that juxtaposition helps us to begin to understand both some of the legacies of indigenous society, but also some of the characteristics of colonial society too. Um, and so on kind of a practical level, Aitzuri points out by reading international newspaper, certainly, of course, we definitely want to read the accounts, the news that comes out of Latin America. So many of you maybe are aware of the wave of massive protests that gripped the region beginning last year in 2019. This is certainly something that weighs heavily on any conversation about Latin American politics. We should study it in a way that considers stereotypes and biases and works to thin those out of our research. Good, Quinn. Absolutely. We want to try to use a method that would help us to sort of get around some of those biases and kind of see beyond some of our stereotypes that we may or may not realize that we have. By their cultural regions, certainly. So there are some differences within Latin America across regions within the region. And so, for example, the Andes are going to be different than the Southern Cone countries. And Brazil, for instance, doesn't even often want to include itself in the Southern Cone countries, but it often still is anyway. But the point is there's a lot of diversity. Ishan says we can study the political institutions of some of the more stable countries in the region versus the less stable ones in the area to see if those reasons for stability could apply to the US. Totally. Yes, Ishan, we absolutely could learn a lot about the United States by studying the processes of, of Latin American countries. And, you know, for example, the institutions or the executive branch or the Congress or congressional executive relationships. Marcella says we can start to interact with the locals and see if there are similarities and differences between the people's experiences. Absolutely. Absolutely. We may be studying voting behavior, and we might identify differences in the ways that different social groups or social classes in Latin American countries vote. We already pointed out that tremendous diversity. We could study those differences in how they form their decision making and how they arrive at maybe who they vote for. There's a lot of really important research on that kind of topic, and it gets into things like clientelism and relationships between political parties and different social classes. And surprise, clientelism, it owes the most to Latin America and scholars of Latin American politics precisely because of those very diverse social classes and those different relationships with parties. And so that's exactly right. We can learn about those differences. We can study those differences. Alondra definitely agrees that we should study it to learn how it can affect us or what can occur within one's own places. Certainly. Yeah, there's this great old quote about how, you know, if you only stay in Paris, you don't really know Paris. But if you leave and go to London, you begin to know Paris. And I don't mean to impose a sort of West-centric example here, but my point is to say that we can learn more about our own place here if we want to by studying Latin American countries. And so it's a very good reason for us to study Latin America. And I would encourage all of us to think about what we can learn about US politics by studying, say, you know, Chile or maybe even Venezuela or some of these cases that might not seem that similar, but would have maybe more similarities than you realize. Christian says, by looking at the various countries, regions, and cultures with a fine comb, keeping in mind the complex aspects that play into the functions and how we understand it in the US. Yeah, by looking at that diversity and really engaging it on its terms and recognizing the differences and the value that that we can really get from looking at them and treating them with the dignity that they really deserve, to be examined fully and carefully, holistically. Leonardo says, based on the first reading, it seems like there is certain criteria on how to study any country. You can have case studies on one country or a large-scale case with multiple countries. That's exactly right, Leonardo. We can use methods of comparison to gain these insights about Latin American countries that we want to gain. And those methods are very useful for studying not just Latin America, but any region of the world. It just so happens that as scholars of Latin American politics, we tend to use these methods a lot too. Gregorio says, I think we should approach Latin American politics in the context and understanding that Latin America doesn't exist in a vacuum. Often, many of the political issues that plague it stem from systematic corruption, somewhat seeded by our own American government. For instance, the banana wars. It's exactly right. We absolutely cannot ignore the legacy of US meddling in Latin American politics, propping up and facilitating military regimes and military takeovers, carrying out aggressive counter actions against economic policies that may have been designed to affect US interests or banana plantations. You name it, Latin American politics is absolutely colored with US involvement. And so acknowledging that it's not in a vacuum means taking that seriously and examining those relationships between the US and Latin America and how they've either changed or persisted the way that they went for so many decades. It's something that we'll deal with later on in the course. Abel says we should study Latin America by their diversity, comparing their different political institutions and their adversities within their countries. Yeah, we can compare them and look at their differences, and we can try to figure out what accounts for those differences and what kinds of challenges that they have and how those challenges might relate to their particular experience. And you'll see that over and over, that even though these Latin American countries have a lot in common, they often have a unique experience that isn't exactly or even that much the same in other places. We can study, why is Paraguay one of the poorest countries in Latin America? Good question. Good question. I want to know that too. I also want to know why Paraguay doesn't have a similar political history. Military rule endured in Paraguay for almost 2 decades after it went away in other places. And so we want to know why democratization took so long in Paraguay. The effect climate change has in different regions, says Samantha. Totally. We can take a look at how maybe different policies affect the ability of countries to cope with climate change and to manage the consequences of climate change. John says we can understand the difference in political climate from Brazil to the US political climate. Yeah, exactly. Brazil and the United States are very often compared because Brazil and the United States are both very racially and ethnically diverse, and there are lots of different classes. And slavery had an important and lasting impact in Brazil, as it did in the United States. And so Brazil and the US are a great comparison, and I would encourage anyone to think about that. Joel says, by considering historic events in considering the government systems of countries in Latin America, macroeconomics of areas, yeah, the economic component is important, and how the government systems change and how history involves itself and plays a role, definitely important. Here's a region with a tremendous history, a long history, that's often grim, but often heroic and noble as well. Those pre-Columbian civilizations, the legacies of indigenous society persist today. And so acknowledging that and considering those systems means thinking about that long history. Climate zones, vegetation zones, and economic activity in Latin America, of course. That would be a good question. Why is Paraguay one of the poorest countries in Latin America? Good question. Sarah says, we can divide regions by the nation they were colonized by and observe the differences in their current government, economy, and socioeconomic status of the people living there. Absolutely, Sarah. We can divide nations in terms of how and the way they were colonized. And what's amazing is that we're going to be doing that here in just a couple days when we pick up with the colonial period in Latin America. And you'll see soon that those colonial institutions had different impacts in different places based on the setup of the institutions. We should incorporate Sabeth says we should incorporate different lens to understand perspectives of the people that actually live there and lifestyles. We can agree with Marcella and talk to locals and people who know the land best. That's exactly right, Sabeth. In fact, there's a movement in political economy, Latin American political economy, that seeks to really kind of elevate the perspectives that are kind of native to Latin America and not kind of smuggling in these US centric theoretical perspectives, using perspectives that tie closely to the actual context in Latin America. And so I'm so happy that you would mention that, because one of the perspectives that we'll deal with in the class does exactly that. And it does that intentionally as an effort to elevate Latin America for its sake. So we will do that. Jose says we can study Latin America by learning how certain aspects affected our history, like the Cuban Revolution, and how it led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Absolutely, and we do. We still study the Cuban Missile Crisis to this day. Deleonor says, I think Chile is the richest country in all of South America, so that would be a good place to start. We could look at the high living standard in a well-developed economy. Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually an approach that I take in my own research, examining Chile because of its particular success developmentally and as a democracy, but also looking at why some institutions have not been reformed successfully despite that performance in Chile. And you're exactly right. We can kind of pick these places that might be particularly consequential because of their experience, and we can compare them to other countries. So Chile and Paraguay, for example, we could compare them and try to figure out why Paraguay is so poor and Chile is so rich. Juan Antonio Hernandez Perez says, I think we can talk about how in US politics, when they refer to Latin America, they always just point the finger to Mexico and just make these assumptions. Yeah, the stereotypes are just rotten to the core, and they're totally false. And they paint an image that is meant to scare and frighten voters, and turn them away from embracing a population that I've only ever experienced love from. And the Mexican population in the United States is enormous and growing and vitally important. And so those stereotypes are just rotten. And we can look past those in this class, and we can acknowledge them as for being false. And then we can work our way back up and study these places for what they really are. Yendi says we should study the hatred within Latin America itself, like Mexico and El Salvador. Well, I think what you'll find is that some of the particular problems that we face in Latin America that maybe relate to gang violence, or there's tensions between groups that may be involved in organized crime. Those tensions and those antagonisms result in what we have referred to as the real war in Mexico, which is the drug war. And though in recent years it's cooled off a little bit compared to earlier periods, that drug violence is real, and it's been devastating for places like Mexico and El Salvador. So we will deal with that in the class, and we can study that and try to get a sense of how does that happen, and what is driving that conflict in that civil war, if we'll call it that, in a place like Mexico. Alejandro says, I think we should study Latin America by focusing on the countries individually, whether it be culturally, economically, environmentally, politically, instead of directly comparing the countries because they are so unique and complex in their own ways and deserve to be studied thoroughly. We can focus on areas such as US involvement, colonialism, culture, language, and how other non-Latin American groups have impacted the Latin American countries we know of today. Absolutely, Alejandra. And I think that what you'll find is that even if we make comparisons, we can also really examine the uniqueness of individual countries. And the case study approach permits us to treat each country on its own merits and on its own basis, while simultaneously maybe examining the patterns that emerge among those pairs of countries that we examine. And so I personally like the case study approach because it lets me do that. It lets me dignify and treat as a holistic entity that case, but also compare it and maybe think about how it fits with other cases. Luis says, to fully understand the study of historical, social, and cultural climates of Latin America, how globalization played a major role in Latin America, and how these aspects of society build on each other to create Latin America till this day. Absolutely. These are elements of the story that cannot be forgotten or missed. And they're so essential to understanding the big picture that we absolutely have to include them. Okay, this is a great set of contributions, everyone. We're going to pick up and continue. How should we study Latin America? Well, it's a complicated place, as we've pointed out, and all of these topics and all of this diversity, all of this sophisticated, unique, this tapestry of different characteristics, but the commonalities that might bind them still. This is a very sophisticated place, and how we begin to study such a diverse place has important consequences for the kinds of consequences that we can identify or the conclusions that we can draw. And so the first thing I want to do is encourage you to think of Latin America in terms of puzzles and problems. And the first question you want to ask yourself is, what interests us? What are we into? What moves us? What excites us? What do we feel inspired by? Or what are we willing to really do the work to learn about and write about? What makes you think twice? What causes you to take a moment and pause and think about your own experience or what you might have to say or what you could say to that topic? So for example, we might ask ourselves the following types of questions. Why did Chile and Argentina elect women presidents in 2006 and 2007, respectively? Why did those countries re-elect those women in 2014 and 2011? That's a question that talks about women in politics and the experience in two Latin American countries. We might ask ourselves, why did party systems collapse in some countries like Peru and Venezuela, but not in other countries like Chile and Colombia? Why did Venezuela revert to authoritarian rule in the late 2010s while other Latin American countries did not? Why do the guerrillas keep on fighting in Colombia, but nowhere else in Latin America? Why were so many leftist presidents elected in Latin America in the first 2 decades of the 21st century? Why have democracies survived for the longest period in Latin American history? Why are indigenous groups organized in mass movements in some Latin American countries like Ecuador, but not in others like Peru? All of these questions involve puzzles. These are questions that emerge out of an interesting puzzle or contrast that we are observing in a particular area of Latin America. This isn't just a set of topics, this is also a set of contrasts, a set of puzzles, a set of problems. And this set of problems draws on the first comparative method that I want to teach you today. And that method is asking questions. Now, you'll notice that those questions take a particular form. We're not just asking, why are there guerrillas fighting in Colombia? No. We're asking, why are there guerrillas fighting in Colombia, but nowhere else in Latin America? We're not asking why did Chile transition to democracy? We're asking, why did Chile transition to democracy while Paraguay did not? And so on and so forth. We're taking a particular approach to asking these questions. We're noticing 2 or more cases with similar characteristics but different outcomes. We're noticing cases with 2 or more cases with different characteristics but similar outcomes. And these different patterns or these different designs, if you will, go by different names. If we're picking out 2 or more cases with similar characteristics but different outcomes, like Chile and Paraguay, similar characteristics but different outcomes, one is very rich, the other is very poor, that is a most similar systems design. We're saying that we have these 2 very similar countries, but they differ in terms of the outcome of interest to us. What explains why Chile is rich but Paraguay is poor? We have also a most different systems design, as we call it. And this is where we have 2 or more cases with different characteristics, but similar outcomes. Now, this is a little harder in Latin America because the countries are usually quite similar. But I'll give you an example. Say we have 2 countries that have very different party systems. One party system is extremely consolidated and very strong. The other one is extremely weak. And both of those party systems collapse. That's an example of a most different systems design. We have two cases with different characteristics, different types of party systems, but a similar outcome. Now, these sets of most similar and most different cases, these puzzles that we identify, these are the puzzles that lead to our research questions. Our questions come out of these puzzles. So I want to show you this slide again, and I want to draw your attention to the red text. Notice that the red text is where we draw the contrast between the cases in our example or in our question. So it's not why did party systems collapse in some countries like Peru and Venezuela? It's why did party systems collapse in Peru and Venezuela, but not in Chile and Colombia? It's not why did Venezuela revert to authoritarian rule? It's why did Venezuela revert to authoritarian rule while other Latin American countries did not? It's not why did the guerrillas keep fighting in Colombia? It's why do the guerrillas keep fighting in Colombia, but nowhere else in Latin America? It's not why are indigenous groups organized in mass movements in some Latin American countries. It's why are indigenous groups organized in mass movements in some Latin American countries while not in others. And what you notice is that each one of these contains a puzzle, right? A contrast, a key set of differences that we can identify as a puzzle, and we can ask a research question to try to better understand. So we've got our first method. Our first method is asking questions. And this is a vitally important method because we can't really begin to address a topic until we have a specific question that helps to identify the core sort of issue or problem that we're addressing. So we have our list. We have our list of questions. Now let's select one of the topics from that list. And what we're going to do is we're going to carry out the remaining steps in our three-step comparative research process. I'm teaching you three methods today. The first method is asking questions. Now we're going to take up the second and the third method. We're going to take up a question from our list and we're going to use it as an example. We're going to walk through the entire process together. Now, our topic is party system collapse. Now, what is that? Party system collapse involves the disappearance of an entire party system by democratic means. Basically, what this is when voters abandon parties and stop voting for traditional political parties. They turn their backs on the parties. And over the course of 3 elections, the party system, the parties collapse. They lose virtually all their seats in office. They lose representation, and they lose the strength to persist in this setting. And what happens is, as these parties collapse, the system cannot rehabilitate itself and cannot reconstruct itself. And those individual parties cannot resurrect themselves, and they go by the wayside. They are extinguished, and they collapse and are destroyed. And what happens is the new political parties that emerge in the wake of the collapse of the traditional party system take a different form in a different configuration than the parties that preceded the collapse. The competition between parties is also reset. This is a transformation in the party system. Now, this happened in Peru and Venezuela. This happened in both those countries. In Venezuela, it happened between 88 and 2000. In Peru, it happened between 85 and 1995. In these countries, the party systems collapsed and voters turned their backs on the parties. Now, this is interesting and significant because this is something that we often discuss here in the United States. How often have we heard someone say, I wish we could just do away with the traditional parties? And why wouldn't we want to? They tend to serve the elites and they're not very responsive to ordinary people. Well, what am here to tell you is that in Peru and Venezuela, the voters actually got rid of the parties. They actually did it. They voted them out en masse, and they destroyed the party system as they knew it. And those traditional parties were totally dismantled. And in the wake of their destruction arose new parties and smaller parties and parties that represented different interests and that would structure a new set of competitive relationships between groups in society. So let's take a look at first the case of Venezuela. And I want to just show you what this looks like in the data when we actually examine the process ourselves. I'm going to take a look at the chat really quickly here. Have there been cases where the voters destroyed the party system and then that party arose but with a different name? What we tend to see, Marcella, is that if they do reemerge, they don't reemerge around the same personalities and the same ideologies that they previously had. Usually that resurrection has to transform the original actors if they are to sort of insert themselves in the new order. And the reason is because the voters are so discontented with those old parties that they're not at all drawn to the ideas that still relate to those old parties. So it's a fresh start, more or less. Okay, so let's take a look at did it go well for them? I'm not sure who them is. The ones who got back in, who reinserted themselves, typically they don't do that well because the voters have made their choice. Let's take a look here. The voters, did it go well for them? Interesting question. Interesting question. We'll deal with that in a moment here in the consequences of party system collapse, because they are quite challenging, to say the very least. But I want to show you the change in Venezuela between 1988 and 2000. So 1988, right here, we have 94% of voters supporting system-sustaining parties. That means casting votes in favor of the traditional political parties. Flash forward to July of 2000, same type of election, presidential. Look at that, from 94% to 0%, 0%, 94 to 0. And 100% of voters had switched to non-system sustaining parties. That is to say, new parties that totally reset competition and relationships in the system. That is an astounding piece of data. And I'm showing you this because I want you to see this in the data and see what this looks like during the space between 1988 and 2000 over the course of these 3 presidential elections. Let's take a look at Peru. Peru is also interesting. We'll go to 1980. Presidential election in 1980, 90%, 89% of the voters voted for system-sustaining parties. That is to say, traditional parties. You go to the presidential election of 2000 and the second election of 2000, and what you see is astonishing. You see 1% and 0%, from 89% to 1% and 0%. That is an absolute astounding transformation over the space of 20 years. That means the entire society is abandoning those traditional parties. That is the collapse of the party system in Peru. This is a transformation that's important because it means that there's something very systematic going on here in both of these countries. But before we deal with what's happening in these countries, I want to pause and explain to you why this is bad or why this is potentially grave for a democracy. It may not be bad, but the consequences can be perilous. Why does it matter if parties collapse or don't collapse? Well, the reason that it matters is because political parties are essential to a democracy. They are aggregators of demands. They connect voters to the political process. They recruit political leaders. They transfer power and structure power relationships between actors in society. They also exert influence of their own, and they can help to influence and control institutions that might offset abuses by the executive or some other actor, maybe like the military. So strong parties are important if they're consolidated and well established. That's usually even better because that means they have deep roots in society. Now, what happens though is that if parties collapse, what happens is it creates a power vacuum. And though there may be new parties that get new votes, what tends to happen is that populists, individual leaders who are personalistic and charismatic, tend to emerge. And what they do is they discredit and they abuse those democratic rules of the game that may previously have been promoted by the parties themselves. And so it's usually the case that populists fill the void. If party systems collapse, usually what happens is personalistic leadership takes its place. And thus begins a series of problems of legitimacy for the democratic regime. It can lead to the collapse of the regime and a transition to authoritarian rule and a reversal of democracy. So these parties are vitally important. And the collapse of a party system is consequential because it lays the groundwork for what can be the destruction of the democracy itself by a populist leader, a dictator, who can very easily ride roughshod over the remaining institutions. Let's take a quick look at the chat. Could we possibly do that in the US? Hey, it's possible. It happened in Peru and Venezuela. I have no doubt that it could happen in the US. It's totally possible. How was this data obtained? This is data from an article on the topic, and I'm pulling from that article to use some of the data. I'll cite it in the slides, and I'll post the slides if you want me to. Was there a specific event that can be tied to this change in voter beliefs in either of the two countries? We're getting there, Jet. We're going to deal with the specific hypotheses that help to explain what happened, and it's very interesting, and I think that you'll learn a lot from that. But let's return to this comparison of Peru and Venezuela. The truth is that even though both these cases are very interesting, looking at them by themselves is not sufficient to understand these cases of party system collapse. The truth is that we have to look beyond Peru and Venezuela. If we examine Peru and Venezuela, we can do a number of things. We can sharpen our powers of description: who, what, when, where, and why. We can examine the cases to form new hypotheses. We can maybe look at the cases to think about potential theories that we could build. But the issue is that we cannot use these cases to test those hypotheses. Hypothesis testing requires us to examine positive and negative cases of the phenomenon at the same time, right? So it's not enough to just study a single incident that happened. We also have to study a case where it didn't happen, right? So we have to kind of see both sides of the universe, so to speak, the trajectory where it occurred and the one where it did not occur. And so what that means then is we have to find comparisons that cut across different cases where it happened and where it did not happen. And that means that we need methods of comparison. We need methods that we can use to put cases side by side that did not have the same outcome. So what we're going to do is we're going to add the cases of Chile and Colombia. Now, Peru and Venezuela both experienced party system collapse because the voters abandoned the parties. But that did not occur in Chile and Colombia. In fact, in Chile and Colombia, the party systems remained very robust, very consolidated, very strong, and they persisted, and they are still persisting to this day. But these countries are relatively similar to Venezuela because they have a lot in common in terms of the background characteristics. And so what that means then is we have an interesting puzzle. We have a puzzle that involves positive and negative cases that are otherwise mostly similar in terms of some key characteristics that we can isolate on to try to get some analytical leverage. So this means then that we have two different types of comparative approaches. On the one hand, Peru versus Venezuela is a most different systems design. This is a system where the two cases have different characteristics, but they have the same outcome. And the different characteristics that I pointed out are a highly institutionalized system, party system in Venezuela, where there had two parties, very, very well-established ideology, limited role for personalities of individual leaders, well-established, robust, rule-based party system. In Peru, you had something very different. You had a weakly institutionalized system where very weak parties with very shallow ideologies, poorly established rules, and very strong personalities populated the system. Very, very different. But in both of these cases, the party system collapsed. Both systems collapsed. On the other hand, we've got Venezuela versus Chile and Colombia. This is a most similar systems design. All three of these countries had very institutionalized systems. Venezuela was very similar to Chile and Colombia because Chile and Colombia both had roughly two parties or two coalitions of parties. And these parties and party coalitions had very well-established ideologies, rules, and they didn't tend to fall prey to the personalities of individual leaders. Now, despite the similarities between these party systems, only Venezuela's party system collapsed. And so what you see here is that we're kind of isolating on key patterns of similarity and difference, key configurations of similarity and difference. We're isolating on patterns that show differences across cases. We have then party system collapse in Peru, Venezuela, Chile, and Colombia. And our question is the following. This is the puzzle that comes out of these problems in contrasts and patterns. Why did party systems collapse in two quite different cases, Peru and Venezuela, but not in other cases, Chile and Colombia? This is a clear contrast that we can examine to get a handle on. We can use level of excuse me, everyone. We can use level of abstraction and scope of countries rule, right? Yes, I believe you're getting that from the reading, and you can use that, absolutely. In this case, we're treating these cases as relatively similar as well as different between the four of them. So we have these two puzzles. We have these two puzzles between Peru, Venezuela, Chile, and Colombia. Now, our question then is, how can we understand party system collapse in Venezuela and Peru, but not in Chile and Colombia? Now we have to form hypotheses that could help us to explain these outcomes. This is our second method. Now, a hypothesis is an argument that links cause to effect. In social science, we call these things independent and dependent variables. Now, cause is the independent variable, effect is the dependent variable. And our hypotheses will always connect these two things. Now, our hypotheses have got to have two important characteristics. First of all, they must be causal. That is to say, they must identify a cause of some variation, and they must be testable and falsifiable. That means they must be able to be tested and shown to be false, as well as shown to be correct. Now, what this looks like always begins with a series of different causes, or a series of different variables that might have some hypothesized impact on the outcome of interest. So our question is, what causes party system collapse? How can we understand party system collapse systematically? I've got 5 hypotheses here that could explain, potentially, party system collapse. Now, let's go through those hypotheses one by one before we take a look at how those different hypotheses are elaborated when we actually play with the variation. First, the hypothesis of acute crisis. This is the hypothesis that emphasizes the presence of an acute or a sustained crisis that questions the ability of the system-sustaining parties to govern. So basically, this is an event that discredits and weakens all of the existing political parties and shows them to be frauds. This is a crisis that discredits them and sets about a process of disillusion with those parties. We also have extremely low or high institutionalization. This is basically party systems that are extremely brittle because they're unresponsive to voters because of their extraordinarily level of consolidation in their rigid organization, or their extraordinary flexibility in their lack of organization. Both of these can be very detrimental because it means that the parties won't be responsive to voters. Voters will become discontented and so on. The third hypothesis is a role for an anti-establishment figure, someone who comes in and discredits those existing institutions and says, those parties are all corrupt, they're all fraudulent, they're cheating you, vote for me, don't vote for the parties, I'm an independent, I'm running for office, and I'll fix the system without the help of the parties. These are individuals who are very destructive because they can destroy democratic institutions by discrediting them and undoing them once they come into power. There's also a hypothesis, military intervention. And this is direct or indirect military involvement in the political process. And then finally, a hypothesis for second reverse wave of democratization. This is a period after the post-war period when democracies began to break down and revert to authoritarian rule. This is a period that becomes important for us because it could be the case that the weakening of democratic institutions at earlier points in time could make them more vulnerable to collapse later. So let's take a look at these individual hypotheses. Let's take a look at the chat first. May you explain the second cause again? Absolutely. The second cause, extremely low or extremely high levels of party system institutionalization. An extremely institutionalized party system is one where the parties have a very rigidly established ideology and they have very well-established rules. These rules and ideologies that become so set can become brittle and inflexible, and it can make it difficult for the parties to respond to voters. Now, the same thing can happen if the parties are very weakly institutionalized. That is to say, if they're extremely inchoate or flexible, they don't have set ideologies, they don't have set rules. In the same way that extremely institutionalized parties become brittle and unresponsive, parties that don't have any ideology or any rules at all also become unresponsive. And so in that sense, extremely low or extremely high institutionalization can make party systems vulnerable to collapse because of the difficulty that that parties have in responding. Can I repeat the first three, please? Wait, if this is the case, then what is low or high institutionalization? In this data, we're distinguishing between extreme institutionalization and high or low institutionalization. So there are like layers of differentiation here. This is how the original authors in a study on this topic dealt with the institutionalization variable. It was asked if I could repeat the first three. We're gonna go through these individually, and I think that it'll make much more sense. And then hopefully we can get a better sense of what those hypotheses are. I know that this is kind of getting detailed, but bear with me here. We're gonna work through this one by one. Crises in party system collapse. Our hypotheses are as follows. In societies that have acute social, political, or economic crises, party systems will collapse. The reason is because crises lead to societal discontent and voters lose confidence in the parties that are representing them currently, and they turn their backs on those parties in the presence of these crises. In societies that don't experience these crises, party systems will be sustained because in those societies, voters will not be discontented by prolonged emergencies or system-wide failures. And so based upon whether or not a crisis is in place or not, we can expect party system collapse to go different ways. That's one hypothesis. We have another hypothesis. Institutionalization. Extremely low or high institutionalization tends to make parties unresponsive to society, and that can produce discontent. So in societies with extremely low or extremely high levels of institutionalization, party systems will collapse. That's our first hypothesis. Our second hypothesis is that societies without extremely low or high party system institutionalization, in those societies, party systems will be sustained because those societies will see their parties respond much more flexibly and effectively to the changing demands of people in society. That's the second hypothesis. The third hypothesis is the anti-establishment figure and collapse hypothesis. And what we see here is the hypothesis in societies with an anti-establishment figure who may discredit existing democratic institutions in a bid to concentrate power, party systems will collapse. These figures tend to weaken or discredit parties and can bring them down entirely based upon the strength of that individual. Secondly, our hypothesis, the other hypothesis would be in societies without an anti-establishment figure, party systems will be sustained. So the opposite outcome should occur when a society does not have that kind of a figure. So this is the anti-establishment figure hypothesis. We'll go over the last two hypotheses, the last two types of hypotheses. The first of our last two is on military intervention. And military intervention is really corrosive because militaries tend to discredit civilian institutions. Usually parties are often first on the list because parties can threaten the power and the privilege of militaries, especially militaries that previously were in power. So this can weaken or destroy democratic institutions, including parties. So we can actually hypothesize that in polities where the military intervenes in politics, party systems will collapse. Secondarily, the other hypothesis would be, well, in polities where the military does not intervene in politics, party systems will be sustained. So depending upon whether or not military intervention is common, the party system collapse variable should go different ways. Here's our last and our final set of hypotheses, and these relate to the second reverse wave of democratization and collapse phenomenon or historical process that took place in the mid 20th century. So the logic here is simple. In countries where democratic institutions failed in the past, they are more likely to fail again. And those institutions could be party systems, they could be other types of institutions, doesn't matter. So we can hypothesize then that first, countries that reverted to authoritarian rule midway through the 20th century are more likely to see their party systems collapse later on if and when democracy is restored. And secondly, countries that did not revert to authoritarian rule are more likely to see their party systems be sustained because those democratic institutions will be stronger in comparison. Now, these are our various hypotheses. Can I simplify that? Can I simplify the second reverse wave, John? The second hypothesis. I'll come back to that. So everyone, we're actually out of time, and it's okay because we've got a little bit left on this lecture on comparative methods, but we can finish that on Wednesday before we start up with the colonial period. So we will retire for now. And if you would like to stick around for maybe a couple minutes and chat or ask me questions, that's fine. I do have to be out in about 5 or 10 minutes for a next class. But if you're done and if you are content with what you've learned today, you can be on your way. Otherwise, I'll stick around for a moment and I'll take some questions. I have a question. Will the slides help during the exam or the readings? The slides might be useful as you prepare for the exam. And you'll want to refer back to all the materials, I think, as you prepare for the exam. Ishan, I need to know which is right. Can you clarify what you mean by which is right? I'm not sure what you're asking. Would you say Trump is an anti-establishment candidate, but the Republican Party had a balanced institution to handle and therefore preserve the two-party system? That's Jet. That's an important debate that we can have. I don't know if I'm prepared to issue a comment on that just yet. You're very welcome, Alejandra, and I'm sure that the rest of us appreciate your input as well. Thank you, Sarah. Have a nice day. Thank you. Thank you, Carmina. Which hypothesis fits the puzzle question? Oh, I see, Ishan. Yes, so we're gonna pick that up on Wednesday. We're gonna actually test those hypotheses and we'll see which one is right. And so Ishan, hang tight. And I think that you'll be interested to see which hypothesis does the most work when it comes to explaining party system collapse. We'll test it in all 4 countries, and so we'll see. Very excited to do that with you. Can you unmute? Yes, John. Do I need to unmute you, or can you unmute yourself?
Hello, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I just wanted to ask because I don't think I was clear on the hypothesis for the second reverse wave of democratization.
Okay.
Because you said that midway through 20th century, it reverts back to authoritarian rule. I wanted to ask a question. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so this one is kind of a little loaded, and thank you for asking this question. So what I mean is that a lot of countries in Latin America transitioned to democracy after the end of World War II in like the 50s. But some of them reverted back to authoritarian rule in the 60s and the 70s. So those democracies broke down and a lot of military regimes took over. So what I'm saying here is in those countries where that reversion took place, those countries are going to be more likely to see their party systems collapse because those institutions will be weaker as a result of the reversal that took place a decade earlier. Does that make a little bit more sense?
Yes, Professor.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. Will a video recording of this meeting be made available? Absolutely. I'm recording them, and I'm going to be posting links to YouTube videos where you can view them and you can download them at your convenience. And so they will be available. I'll post the slides as well. And as a reminder, we'll be picking up the rest of this lecture on Wednesday. We'll be testing those hypotheses and getting to the bottom of it for Ishan and others so that we can figure out what explains the puzzle. The slides will be under files on CAT courses for the course. And you'll find a folder that says slides. No, Alicia, there is no homework with the exception of the reading assignments that I require you to complete before you come to class. So I don't require you to complete any written work for those reading assignments, but we do expect you to complete those readings. Is it possible to share the notes up on CAT courses? John, do you mean the lecture slides? Oh, notes. So notes that that students take. Oh, you made notes. You made notes. So you want to put it up. Let's talk about that. We might be able to create some kind of system where everyone can do that. But I'd like to maybe discuss it before we start that because I want to have some control over some of the content on CAT courses. But thank you, John. That is very useful. Can you send me an email, John, and we can maybe discuss that? Thank you, John. You're a good Samaritan. You're a good classmate. All right, everyone. I think that we still have about 10 of us in here, and I think that I'm going to leave in the next minute or so to prepare for my class at the turn of the hour. And so, if there's anything else that you'd like to ask me about real quickly, I'd be happy to take it. Otherwise, I'm going to stop the recording and save the recording for posting later, as well as the posting of the slides. So there still are a few of us here, and just kind of let me know if you've got something you'd like me to address. Otherwise, I'll be on my way here in just a moment. All right, everybody, I'm going to stop the recording and save the recording for posting. I'll see you on Wednesday. Thank you very much for your contributions and for being here with us tonight. We'll finish it up and set out on our next segment on Wednesday. Thanks so much, and I will see you.